Today's session is the last of a series on growing tomatoes in the home garden. If you register for this webinar, you'll receive today's recording, links to previous sessions, plus resources mentioned in this talk. If you did not, please visit our website shown on this slide for all of the 2024 webinar recordings. Today, Jane Collier and I will cover these topics. By the end of the session, we hope you will know when to plant the tomato start into the garden, the best way to support a large plant, how to prune, water, and fertilize, and how to deal with hot weather, and know something about disease and disorders, how to identify and manage them, and finally, how to maximize production and ripen tomatoes sooner. When should you plant the tomato into the garden? Well, if you live in the northern part of the Willamette Valley where I live, not right now, it's still too cool. Tomatoes are tropical in nature, so we want to wait until it's warm enough. And that means night temperature is consistently 50 degrees or above, and soil temperature during the day is 60 degrees. In Western Oregon, usually that happens in late May to early June, depending on the weather. So this is where a soil thermometer will come in handy for you to know exactly when the soil is ready. But before you put the tomato into the garden, you need to put them through a hardening off process. And this can happen anytime in the middle to late May, right now or next week. You usually harden off the plant over a period of 10 to 14 days. And this means gradually increasing the exposure of your plant to sunlight and outside conditions. So you would begin with a few hours in dapple sun and then move it into full sun for a few hours and eventually graduate it to being out all day. And finally, they can stay out all day and all night. But before you put them out all night, watch the weather forecast and carefully choose when you do that. And if you have a protected space under the eave or against a concrete wall, that can make the transition a little easier for your plants. And how do we know if the soil is warm enough? We can take the temperature using a soil thermometer. The best way to take soil temperature is do it in the mid-morning for several days and then average the reading. And if you're getting an average that's close to 60 degrees, it's time to plant into the garden. You want to space plants according to their type, whether they're determinate, which means that they will be smaller, or indeterminate, which means that they will get huge. And allow at least 2 to 3 feet apart. And if you grow them in rows, the rows should be 4 to 5 feet apart. You may know tomatoes have adventitious roots, and adventitious is Latin for extraordinary. And this refers to plants growing roots from abnormal places like stems or leaves. So tomatoes can grow roots from the stem when they're in contact with soil. So we recommend burying a portion of the stem where you plant your tomato into the garden. And this will allow you to get a bigger root system, and the plant will be more robust and produce more fruit. But this method only applies to own root tomatoes, not grafted tomatoes. So continuing with planting own root tomatoes, you have two choices. You can plant vertically, like how we plant most other plants. You dig a hole, in the instance of tomatoes, that's 10 to 12 inches deep, so quite deep. You want to remove the lower leaves and then plant deep, burying a portion of the stem. You can also plant the trench method, and in this approach, you would make a trench that's 6 to 8 inches deep, lay the plant sideways, remove the lower leaves, and then bury the lower stems and leave the top exposed. And don't worry about the odd position of the plant after being planted in the trench method. It will correct its orientation in a few days. So quickly comparing these two methods, the trench method will speed up early season growth because the roots are in shallower, warmer soil. But when summer heat comes, these roots can dry out faster. The vertical method is just the opposite effect. Early growth is slower because the roots are deep and the soil is slow to warm up. But then the deeper roots in the middle of a summer becomes a benefit because it has greater access to water and it's less likely to dry out. And again, I want to remind you, use these methods, planting deep, burying a portion of the stem only to tomatoes that is not grafted. If you plant a grafted tomato too deep, you lose the benefit of the grafted rootstock. So you should plant the grafted tomato at the same soil level as it is in its pot. Now your tomato is in the ground, you want to give it a sturdy support structure. These pictures show a whole bunch of options, and practically you can probably make tomato support out of all sorts of materials that are handy. And if you are wondering if you really need to support your tomatoes, yes, you do. There are many benefits to supporting a tomato with a good size structure. One of them is it'll save space and avoid crowded out plants. It can help you increase the exposure to sunlight and give you bigger, better quality fruit. And it can keep your plant healthier by keeping it off the ground and access to soil-borne pathogens. So you can support tomatoes with stakes. You can use a single stake, like in the illustration on the left. You can use multiple stakes, make a teepee or its own support structure by leaning them together. You can even build a bigger trellis of sorts, like the illustration on the right. Whatever you choose, it is important that you only use soft materials to tie the stem to the support structure. And a figure 8, like what's shown in the illustration, is a good way to do it. It's secure, but make sure to allow enough room for the stem to grow. I have seen some people tying their tomato stems too tight to the support structure and ending up girdling the plant, because once the leaves start growing, you just don't notice those ties anymore. So allow enough room at the beginning. You can also use cages. They're good options because with the proper structure and the material choice, they can be very sturdy. And the smaller cages, like the one shown in the center of this page, probably will work okay for a determinate tomato, but indeterminate varieties need something that's close to 5 feet or even taller. You can buy them, but you can also make them. The photo on the right shows a DIY model that's made from PVC pipes. And these are not glued. So they are just friction fit at the beginning of the season. You can adjust the size because they're modular. And at the end of the season, they can be taken apart and kept in a bucket. So it's quite a good idea to try out. Whatever support structure you use, make sure you put in the structure when you plant, because if you come back with whatever the structure is, you run the chance of damaging either the root or a portion of the plant. All right, so our tomato is planted and supported, and it needs water to grow well. We know wet foliage is more vulnerable to disease, so it's a good idea to keep water um, off them. And so if you water with a hose or some other implement, make sure that you minimize the splashing or not splashing into the plant. But the images on this screen that shows the soaker hose and micro sprayers or a DIY repurposed soda bottle are good ways to water your tomato because there will be no water splashing at all. So here are some watering tips. Our two goals in watering, we want to water in a way that will encourage deep roots. And we want to water in a way to avoid the soil drying out in the root zone. So when your tomato plant is really small, you want to keep the soil moist. But as it grows and the root expands, the top layer, 1 or 2 inches, can be allowed to dry out. That's not a problem because your roots most likely are deeper than that. And if you have clay or clay loam-based soil, you can water deeply once every 7 to 10 days. This will allow you to build a strong root system. The roots will go deeper and they will be more resilient during the hot weather. If you have sandy soil, obviously the cycle will be shorter, probably every 5 days or so. And how much water? Usually you'll hear people say 1 inch per week is the normal recommendation. And if you're looking at a 5 square feet area, 1 inch per week is 3 gallons. I put my tomatoes in 5 square feet cages, and that 3 gallon per week is a helpful guide for me when I do the watering. And of course, these general rules are do not apply during extreme heat. We'll need to water more often and perhaps in greater quantities. And always check the soil moisture to determine the need before and after. Make sure the water has penetrated deep enough after a session. And before the watering session, check to make sure the soil really needs to be watered. Just know that inconsistent irrigation in tomatoes can lead to the fruit cracking or the blossom end rot. And a caveat about watering, when fruits are actively ripening after they have already taken intense color, water sessions or too much water can cause splitting of the fruit, and they definitely dilute the flavor of the tomatoes. So when you're actually harvesting, keep that in mind, and you may want to decrease the watering in order to have better flavor fruit. Now let's look at fertilizing. Tomatoes are heavy feeders and they need a low nitrogen fertilizer. And as you know, when we talk about fertilizer concentrations, we refer to it as the fertilizer analysis or ratio. And OSU recommends that you use a 1:1 ratio of tomato fertilizer. And those numbers refer to the concentration of nitrogen, phosphorus, and potassium. That's the 3 numbers in the sequence. And as you know, with a tomato plant, we want it to bloom well and fruit well. And that's why the fertilizer for tomatoes should have higher concentration of phosphorus and lower concentrations of nitrogen, which stimulates leaf growth, and potassium, which is good for roots. If you are using synthetic fertilizer, you apply them at planting and mix them into the soil. If you're using organic fertilizer, you want to apply them 1 to 2 months earlier. because it takes time for organic fertilizer to be converted into a form that is usable by your plant. And they require soil microbes to be the middleman. Okay, back to fertilizing, and this is what you do. If your soil is low in organic matter, and how would you know that? Take a look at your soil color. If it's kind of more yellow than kind of rich brown, chocolatey looking, it's probably not high in organic content. So you can add some compost and mix it into the soil in the area where you grow tomato, because they'll definitely benefit from a higher organic content. And you should do that ideally 1 month before planting, but doing it now and plant in a couple of weeks is not a problem. And at planting, you want to mix your 1-to-1 ratio fertilizer and bone meal, which you see has a big center number, middle number, so that's high phosphorus, into each planting hole. And then when the fruit begin to set, you begin a process called side dressing. And again, you use the same fertilizer with the 1-to-1 ratio. And you'll continue with the side dressing every 3 to 4 months if the plant variety continues to grow and the weather conditions are friendly and your plant is robust. So let's talk about what is side dressing. If you have mulched the surface, you want to remove the mulch. And then side dressing is basically applying the fertilizer along the drip line of the plant. You want to mix the fertilizer into the soil, water it well, and then put the mulch back. And notice I'm not saying how much fertilizer you should use at 1 ounce, 2 ounce, a handful, a couple of tablespoons. That's because I don't know what kind of fertilizer you're going to end up buying. I hope you're able to find a fertilizer that's the correct analysis, 1-to-1, but you may end up getting something that's 4-8-4 or 10-20-10. And so I can't really tell you what is the right quantity. But because tomatoes are a very popular vegetable, that practically every household that grows a vegetable will grow a tomato. So you can trust on the fertilizer package, there will be instructions for individual vegetable plant. And every package I've seen mentioned tomatoes. So just follow the instruction on your package and you will be good. So summarizing the fertilizing schedule, 1 month before planting, work compost into the soil. This is only if your soil needs it. At planting, you work into the planting hole fertilizer that is the 1-to-1 ratio and bone meal. And after fruit set begins, when you can see the small fruit, you begin side dressing using the same ratio fertilizer. And we've talked about how to side dress. And if the plant continue to grow and produce fruit, you can continue the side dressing process roughly once a month until the end of the season. Next, let's talk about mulch. Mulch has many benefits, and here are some of them. They can prevent the loss of soil moisture, which comes in really handy in the heat of summer. They can suppress weed growth, which will save us time in managing our gardens. They can cool the soil in the summer, and they can reduce soil erosion. And in addition, they keep water off the leaves to prevent disease. They can prevent soil compaction and crusting on the surface, and they just make the garden look a little more pleasing. So let's look at the two kinds of mulch material that we can use. The organic and plastic mulch each have its own benefit, but they're different. So let's talk about the plastic mulch first. Black plastic mulch can help warm up the soil. This you would use early in the season to speed up warming up the soil and get faster growth after planting. In fact, you can put your plastic mulch in place even a few weeks before planting to warm up the soil and get it ready for planting the tomato out maybe a little sooner. You can also use red plastic. They will reflect light into the tomato plant canopy and increase production. Again, if you use plastic mulch, they should go in at planting or before. You can also use organic mulch. They will keep the soil cool, which is a good thing during the summer. And if you use organic mulch, use it after the soil has warmed up. In the northern Willamette Valley, I usually add organic mulch somewhere around the 1st of July. And you want to spread a layer that's 2 to 4 inches over the root zone of the tomato. And you want to keep the stem clear to give it good air circulation. And for organic mulch, there are a lot of potential materials. I find straw and leaves are the easiest to use. Grass clippings are okay, but too thick a layer, they can get matted, so there are some problems with them. And wood chips are okay, but at the end of the season, you have to remove the wood chips because you don't really want to incorporate them into the soil, while the straw, leaves, and grass clipping can just stay in place and be incorporated into the garden bed next spring. And next, let's talk about pruning. There are many reasons to prune. Pruning will help us manage the growth, especially in very vigorous, indeterminate tomatoes. They allow the air and light to reach the center of the plant for a better quality production. They can result in larger fruit, and they certainly make managing and reaching the plant much easier. So here's the overview of pruning tomatoes. Like any other plant, if you see anything that's damaged or diseased, take it off. And in the early season, when the plant is young, roughly about a foot to foot and a half tall, that's when you remove the lower leaves below the first flower cluster, because those leaves are a ladder for a soil-borne pathogen to reach your plant. And after that, you're checking the growth every week and begin to monitor sucker development. And we want to remove nearly all of the suckers, and I'll talk a little more about that. You also are checking for disease and pest damage, and you want to remove those portions as soon as you see them. And late in the season, while you continue to remove suckers and disease parts, you're also beginning to remove flowers and small fruits that will not amount to anything. And that, coupled with removing the top branch in the indeterminate plant when they go beyond what your support structure can provide the support, you should cut off the top branch. Removing all of those non-productive portions will allow the plant to concentrate its energy on the fruit production and allow you to have better results. So now let's talk about suckers. Suckers is really a horrible term for side shoots in tomatoes, and they should be removed, nearly all of them. So take a look at this photo here. You can see the main stem, and you can see the side shoot where a leaf meets the main stem. And that is what I refer to as sucker. If you actively monitor your tomato plant, you can spot the sucker when it's really tiny, and it's easy just to pinch it off with fingers. If you have an indeterminate tomato, keep in mind they are essentially tropical vines that will keep growing as long as the environment, meaning temperature and actually lack of rain to stimulate pathogen, allow them to grow. So pruning will direct the energy toward fruit production and provide a balance in the foliage that is needed to support the fruit production. And for your indeterminate tomatoes, expect that you will be pruning them through the entire growing season. As long as they're growing, you need to be on top of the pruning. But if you grow determinate tomatoes, they are programmed to grow much smaller in size, and the fruit will form and mature close to the same time within a few weeks. And so they need actually very little pruning. When they're young, you need to remove the lower leaves up to the first flower cluster. And when they're before they're a month old, roughly 3-4 weeks after the planting into the ground, you want to remove the suckers that come out below the first flower cluster, except one. The one that's immediately below it, you want to keep it. And then you're done. And if you do more pruning during the season, you're simply removing the fruiting potential. On the subject of determinate tomatoes, because we know they're well behaved and stay much smaller, yes, you can use individual cages to support them, but if you plant more than one, you can also keep them in a row and use this example as a way to support them. So in this example, we have sturdy stakes at both ends, and then we have stakes between tomatoes. And you would use a twine, tie it to the stake, weave it or go around the front of this plant, wrap around this stake, go behind plant number 2, wrap around the second stake, go in front plant number 3, wrap around the stake, go behind plant number 4, etc., until you get to the other end, and then you double back. And you end up with every plant being supported by a twine in the front and a twine in the back. And as the plant continues to grow, you just repeat the process every 6 to 8 inches vertically by twining more and keep the plant supported. A determinate plant will probably grow to anywhere from 3 to 4 feet tall. So you just continue with the twining. I've done this before, and it's kind of a fun way to grow tomatoes. But I tell you, it uses a lot of twine. And after a while, it kind of gets really tedious with the twining. And be sure you select a twine that is made of a material that can handle the UV light during the season, because it's no fun if your twine begin to decompose when the tomatoes are still producing. Now, how would you train an indeterminate tomato? Well, you have to support it vertically, because remember, there's tropical vines, they just keep growing. And if you have a grafted tomato or a large size tomato, a lot of the heirlooms can get humongous. It's best if you keep them to no more than 3 stems. You can actually grow them as a single stem plant, like in this illustration. So if you grow it as a single stem plant, you want to remove all the leaves below the first flower cluster, and you want to remove all the suckers. No sucker is allowed to grow. So this stem, the one stem, will just keep growing up, and you tie it, support it, and it will continue to put out leaves and flower clusters and give you fruit on the single trunk. But if you want 2 stems, what you do is the same thing with 1 stem, and then from the main trunk, select 1 sucker that is close to your flower packet, so one that's pretty low. And look at this picture here. Here's the main stem, and the sucker has this red arrow pointed to it, was allowed to grow up and form a second main stem. So now we have a two-stem tomato, and that's what they refer to as a Y. So you establish a Y here. When you do this, make sure your second stem is connected to the main stem relatively low. Don't pick one that's already 3 feet above, because there is a lot of weight putting pressure on the stem here, and a lower connection is a stronger one. Now, I usually grow a 3-stem tomato. So all I do is make a Y by allowing one sucker to grow off the main stem, and then I move up and select a second sucker, allowing it to grow. So I end up with a 2Y in my plant, and that gives me 3 stems. So let's review the different pruning. We want to remove the lower leaves below the first flower cluster because they're a ladder for soil-borne pathogens. We want to remove the sucker and stay vigilant. And if we were not, let's say we went on vacation and came back after a couple of weeks, we see these gigantic suckers that we have to remove. Instead of making a huge wound, we can use the Missouri pruning method, which allow us to just cut off a portion of the sucker and to minimize the damage to the plant. We can also speed up ripening of a tomato plant in the late season by root pruning. And root pruning is exactly as it sounds. You simply take a sharp thing, a shovel, for example, cut it around the stem of the plant into the ground and sever the root. And why would you want to do that? Because you can hasten the ripening of your fruit. And when an indeterminate tomato outgrows the space that your support structure has, you can prune off the top and the shoots that are reaching beyond the structure and are no longer supported. And when you do this in the late season, it will speed up the ripening. And when you're at it from late August on into September, you may also begin to prune off the new flowers and tiny fruit. And that will save the energy instead of wasting them on stuff that's not going to be productive, and focus on what you are going to be harvesting. So here's the checklist for pruning indeterminate tomatoes. Prune to 1 to 3 main stems and train to the support. You want to remove suckers vigilantly, and you want to top the plant and cut long shoots when they outgrow the support structure. And the caution is avoid heavy pruning during the middle to late part of summer, because if you remove too much of the canopy, you can stress the plant and result in sun scald. And your pruning schedule may look something like this. If you plant on June 1st, by about the middle of June, you should have removed the lower leaves. And by around the 1st of July, you should have the 2-3 main stems selected and formed. And the rest of July and August, you're just actively managing the suckers and the errant branches that go beyond the support structure. And when the plant is ravaged by rain and cool nights, you would want to harvest and ripen the green fruit indoors, and that will be the end of your tomato season. So with that, I'm going to stop share and invite Jane Collier, my co-presenter, to take it over.
Thank you, Sherry. All right. So I'm going to talk a little bit about things about the tomatoes that Sherry didn't mention. So pollination of tomatoes. Tomato flower is what we call a perfect flower. It has a male and female flower both inside. That means it doesn't need insects or wind to help with pollination, but they can help, but they're not needed. Sometimes the pollination fails, and there are several reasons why your plants might not be pollinated. that you might have extreme temperatures, maybe sometime during when the blossoms are just ready to be pollinated, the temperature may be too low, like below 55, or maybe it's too warm, above 85. Also, if it's too humid out there, this will prevent the pollen from floating around inside of this little flower, and it won't be able to pollinate the male and female parts to the flower. And unfortunately, if it's too dry, then the pollen, sorry about this, then the pollen won't be able to stick to the different parts. But if you're worried that your plant isn't going to be pollinated enough, you can actually do something. Just get out there and just give them a little bit of shake. That'll cause the pollen to drop all around the inside of the flower, and then fertilization can occur. Now, some people have complained that right when the blossoms are getting ready, the blossoms drop off. There are a lot of reasons why that could happen. One is an environmental reason. Maybe you have extreme temperatures. Maybe the wind is blowing too hard and is knocking some of those very tiny, just very succulent little blossoms off. It might have to do with the plant nutrition. Maybe you've given it too much nitrogen. Remember, Sherry talked about nitrogen gives the plants leaf. It's the leaf growth, and that's not what we want. We want the flower growth. So maybe that might be the problem. Or it also might be moisture stress, maybe too much or too little bit of water. Also, there are a couple diseases like botrytis and bacterial bite that can cause a little bit of problem with your blossoms dropping off. Now, some people have said that sometimes they'll have a tomato plant that will fail to flower. They're just none, or maybe not enough, that they think it should have more flowers. There's a lot of reasons that that could happen. It could be some diseases or pests. It could be, once again, too much nitrogen, too much leaf growth. Maybe there's too much heat. Maybe we're having a really hot spell and those flowers just are failing to develop. Also, lack of sunlight. Maybe you planted it in a little bit too much shade. You didn't realize that it was shady in that area in the afternoon. And without sunlight, plants cannot grow. They cannot grow the flowers, which produce the fruit. And I will tell you that there are some varieties and some type of tomatoes that just don't put on as many flower buds or as many fruits as other varieties. So if you are having a problem and you think that you've planted some one or a couple of them one year and they just didn't flower enough, maybe you want to talk to your friends and find ones that they like, that they know that they get a lot of protection out of. Now I'm going to talk a little bit about some weather challenges. The last few years, we've had some bad heat waves in the middle of our summer. So what can we do? Now, Sherry already mentioned this, and she did a lot of good information about putting mulch, why we put mulch on our tomato plants. So like she said, it shields the soil from the hot air, from the hot breeze. If you're going to put straw, which is a good one, good mulch to use, if you're going to put straw around your tomato plants, you might want to start by putting a little bit of compost first, maybe about an inch of compost around your tomato plant to begin with, and then put a few inches of straw on top of that. That way, when the straw is on top, it will help protect the soil. It'll help get that compost that's going to work its way into the soil. And also then remember to water and water deeply. 2 times a week, maybe even more often than that. It depends on how hot it is, depends on how much mulch you put on, how well your mulch is doing. If we're having one of those really hot times and you think your plant is going to be damaged by too much sun, you might be able to cover it with some type of shade cloth. Now, that doesn't mean that this is going to actually work. It might and it might not. We can't guarantee that covering the plant or putting the mulch on during a hot heat wave is going to protect that completely. That's a guarantee we can't make, but you can try to do as much as you can to protect it. So if you want to cover it with some shade cloth, shade cloths come in different percentage of shade. So about a 50% shade cloth would be good. But remember, you don't want to keep it on there forever, just during that heat wave, because remember, in order to make those tomatoes ripen, they do need heat, but we also want some sunshine to keep that plant growing. There's other things that might happen during hot weather. You might have poor fruit set. You might have delayed ripening. Your tomatoes just might not ripen as quickly as they should or as quickly as you want them. They might have yellow shoulders. In other words, the tops might have gotten just a little bit too much sunshine. They also could possibly have what's called white core. If you've ever opened up a tomato and you noticed in the middle of it, it's kind of hard and crusty and white. That's what we call white core, and that could happen if our weather is too hot. Also, blossom end rot, which Sherry mentioned, and I'll talk about also later. Hot weather may cause blossom end rot because blossom end rot is caused by inconsistent watering. And with hot weather, we might not be able to get the water where we want it, when we want it. Now, I want you to look at this plant. You go out there and look at your tomato plants, you're going to know whether it is drought stressed. In other words, maybe you haven't given it enough water. Remember, plants take up water from their roots up into the plant, and the last place that water is available to that plant is the tips of the leaves. So if you go out and you look at your plant and you notice that the tips of the leaves are turning brown, you can think, uh-oh, the water is not getting to the tips. That means I am not watering as much. If you have your tomato growing in a pot, it's even more important because you're going to have to give it more water than you would if it was planted into the ground. Now, there are three sources of tomato problems. There are diseases, there are pests get in there, and then there are growing conditions. In other words, the environment that we're growing them in. So we're going to talk about that. I want to mention the disease triangle. Most of you that are gardeners have already heard of this. For a disease to get into your plant, it needs three things. It needs the host plant, which today we're talking about tomato, that is the host plant. It needs a pathogen. In other words, some type of pathogen needs to be in the area of that host plant. And it needs the environment that helps that pathogen grow and attack your disease triangle. So we're going to take this step by step. Okay, we're going to start with the host plant. What can we do to the host plant to disrupt this disease triangle? Well, you can grow tomatoes that are resistant or tolerant to a lot of diseases. When you buy a plant, you have a plant tag, or if you're going to grow your own tomatoes, you're going to buy a tomato packet, and you will see on it, such as this picture shows you, that it might talk about, it has different letters. This one has VFN and ASC and ST. These letters mean different types of possible plant diseases that the tomatoes get. For example, VFN is verticillium wilt and fusarium wilt and nematode damage. And if you have a T on it, that means that that tomato is resistant, not completely probably, but at least helpful against the tobacco mosaic virus. So if you're having trouble with lots of certain types of diseases on a certain type of tomato, maybe you want to change to a different tomato. So check the plant tags, check the seed packets to see how many different diseases that are resistant or tolerant, or this plant is tolerant to. All right. The second thing to stop that disease triangle from happening is the pathogen. A pathogen must be present. So let's see what we can do about that. Solution number one is to grow your plants at the right time of year. Sherry already talked about this a little bit, about the soil temperature needs to be 60 degrees or above. And out here in our soils right now, maybe some of our soils are 60 degrees. Maybe some of our soils are not. So it's a good idea to get that soil thermometer and check it. If you put your plant in too early and the air temperature is too cold and the soil temperature is too cold, it's going to stress your tomato plant. And when a tomato plant gets stressed, when anything gets stressed, when we get stressed, we don't do as well. And it's the same thing with your tomato plant. If it gets stressed, it's not going to grow as well. It's not going to flower as well. It's not going to produce as well. So let the soil temperature be your guide on when the right time is to put your tomatoes into the ground. Now, a solution two for the pathogen is to rotate your plants each year, and that will avoid the buildup of the recurring pests or diseases. Say if you had, let's say you had, what am I thinking of? How about cucumber beetles that were on your tomatoes year after year? And you left the tomato plant in that same spot. Well, those cucumber beetles are actually going to lay their eggs in the ground. And the next year they're going to hatch out and they're going to come up and affect your tomatoes again. So that's why we say it is very, very important to avoid planting your tomatoes in the same place every year. Rotate them as much as you can. If you don't have a lot of room, some people might have only one garden bed, maybe one small garden bed. Well, please move it as far away from where you had it the first year, move it as far away as you can the second year. We try to tell you to rotate every 3 years. And also you need to think about the plant family. I can't get into that right now. We don't have enough time, but we have a lot of webinars and some of them definitely talk about plant families when we're talking about vegetable growing. So please do check out our webinars also. Now, the third things to make that disease triangle go away would be the environment. So what can we do about the environment so we don't have that disease triangle going on? Solution number one is what you're going to plant in. Plant in some compost-rich soil that's well drained. Make sure it has adequate moisture. The soil needs to be the base of everything. So make sure that the solution to the environmental problem is starting with nice compost-rich soil. And the second solution is not what we start with, but it's what we end with. After the season is over, sanitation is so important when you are growing edibles. Keep your garden clean. Remove all of that debris. Remove those tomatoes that fell off of the vine that aren't any good. Remove them, clean it up, and then once again, rotate your plants the next season, put them in a different spot. Excuse me, I don't seem to be able to get my slide to move. There we go. All right, I'm going to talk about some common disorders and diseases. One is called green shoulders, and you can see that on these tomatoes, and that is caused from high temperatures. When the temperature was so high, and maybe there weren't enough leaves to keep those tomatoes cooler. Now, I'm not talking about sun scald or sunburn yet, but almost. But you can see that the tomatoes, just a little bit of green on the top. Well, the thing to manage that, of course, is to leave some of the leaves above the fruit, and that will shield them from some of the sun. Now, that doesn't mean that these tomatoes aren't any good anymore. Just cut the top off, and the bottom parts of the tomatoes are perfectly fine for you to use. Now, blossom end rot is something almost every tomato grower has a problem with one time or another. It is caused from calcium deficiency, sort of. The reason I say sort of is we normally have enough calcium in our soils. It's normally not a problem. But the only way that a tomato can take up calcium is through water. So if you are not consistently watering your tomatoes, then the calcium is not going to be brought up into the plant. So in other words, if you forget to water your tomatoes for a week, that calcium is in the soil, ready to go up in the tomato, but it has no way to get there. So the management is keep consistent watering practices. And there are a few less susceptible varieties. Those of you that have grown Roma tomatoes, in other words, the paste or sauce tomatoes, they have more of a problem with blossom end rot than some of our slicing tomatoes. So a lot of people that grow Romas complain about the blossom end rot, but remember, inconsistent watering is the problem. Late blight. When late blight comes along, your tomato plant is going to be destroyed. Late blight is an airborne fungus, and the management for this would be to rotate your crops. Definitely rotate your crops. If you have late blight one year, do not put a tomato back in that same area, or you'll have the problem all over again. Don't crowd the plants. Let them have more air circulation. And there are a few varieties that are less susceptible. This is just 3 of them, but there are others out there. Legend, which was developed by Oregon State University, is a really nice tomato. It's one I grow every year, just so I know in case my other ones happen to get late blight, I know my Legend isn't going to, or probably won't. Plum Royal and Mountain Merit are also a couple more varieties you might want to try. Now, cat facing, a lot of times when people see this on their tomatoes, they think it's some kind of disease. Oh no, look at this disease. What's eating up my tomatoes? Well, it isn't. Cat facing is not a disease. It's just a uh, environmental thing. In other words, it can be caused by hot weather or cold weather. It can be caused by something disturbing the flowers during the blossoming time. Maybe it was too windy, maybe an animal got in there, maybe we accidentally bumped the tomato cage or something. Also chilly temperatures at night and herbicide exposure can also sometimes cause cat facing. So you want to avoid excess pruning. You want to avoid excess nitrogen. And there are a few cultivars out there that are less prone to it. But once again, it's not a disease. There's nothing wrong with these tomatoes. Cut that part off and enjoy your tomato as much as you want to. Now, the sun scald and the sunburn is directly caused by sunshine. That just makes sense, doesn't it? So once again, we talked about this before. Yes, you do need to do some pruning on your plant, but don't do excessive pruning, especially right above the fruit. Those fruit are going to need a little bit of shade. And if you think that maybe your plant is too thin on leaves, maybe you do want to put a shade cloth on it while those tomatoes are ripening. Sometimes you will find yellow or discolored leaves. There's lots and lots of things that could cause that. It could be a nutrient deficiency. It could be a pest. Maybe some aphids or something got in there and sucked the juices out of that leaf. It could be a disease. It could be a lack of sunshine. Maybe your tomato plant is planted where it gets too much shade, or it might just be a normal stage of the growth cycle. In other words, sometimes the lower leaves, they're just tired. They were the first to come on. The plant says, I don't care about them anymore, and they're going to turn yellow and fall off. So the management is the first thing you need to do is figure out which one of those causes it is. And after you figure out which cause it is, then you'll know how to manage that particular problem. But like I said, sometimes it might be nothing at all, and there might be nothing you need to do about it. Oh, this picture. This is what you see when you have herbicide exposure. But I can tell you, whenever we have had questions at the Master Gardener office and people send us a picture of this, the first thing they say is it's a disease, it's a disease. We try to tell them, no, no, it was herbicide, it was exposed to herbicide. It's hard for people to believe that, especially if they're not using herbicides. Just remember, maybe the neighbor is using an herbicide, and unfortunately, it was a windy day and it happened to drift. Tomatoes are very, very, what's the word I want to use? Susceptible to herbicide exposure. So be very, very careful if you're using herbicides anywhere in your property, and please do not use them near your tomato plants. Curled leaves on tomatoes. The cause could be low hydration due to wind exposure, maybe excessive heat, maybe, once again, too much nitrogen. So your management for this would be regular irrigation. Don't overdo the nitrogen. And sometimes there just is no management needed. Sometimes this is called physiological leaf roll. Sometimes you'll have a certain tomato plant that just rolls its leaf. But if you look on this photo, you'll notice that there's a nice green tomato on this plant. Sure, the outer leaf is curled, but it's not affecting the rest of the plant. Nothing to worry about. And what if you find holes in your foliage? Well, you know it's from some kind of insect. Is it a caterpillar or a flea beetle or a cucumber beetle? Figure out what it is. And the way to know is to monitor your plant for pests. Go out a lot of times. Remember, we had a webinar on integrated pest management. Well, that was the first thing about integrated pest management is monitoring your plants. Go out there often, lift up those leaves, look at it underneath, see if you can see those pests before they become a problem. And here's some information if you do have insect problems. Well, for one thing, avoid any broad spectrum insecticide sprays because they are harmful to beneficial insects, not just the pest insects. And go out there, just like I mentioned, regular observation, monitor your plants, monitor your plants. Sherry mentioned this before, and I'll do it again. Keep those tomato branches and leaves off of the ground. We don't want those pathogens and insects to come up from the ground onto your plant. And somewhere around your tomatoes, plant some other types of flowers that will attract the beneficial insects that will help you with the problem insects. Here's something that people see a lot. And they always say, is this a problem on my tomatoes? No, it's just called a blossom scar. A lot of heirloom tomatoes have this on the bottom of the tomato. But remember, heirloom tomatoes are some of the best tasting tomatoes out there. So who cares if there's a little scar on the bottom? Just cut that part off and eat that delicious heirloom tomato. Now it's time for you to ripen your tomatoes. I'm going to go quickly through this because I know we're running out of time here. Tomatoes need warmth to ripen. They don't need light after that when they're starting to ripen. They need warmth. The optimal temperature is 68 to 77, but of course, sometimes late in the summer, it gets a little bit warmer. And sometimes a cooler or warmer temperatures will slow down the ripening. So to hasten the ripening, this is what you do. Beginning in early to mid-August, you're going to mulch your plants to keep the soil warm and promote early ripening. You're going to reduce watering and fertilizing, especially not nitrogen. You don't want that. And Sherry mentioned this also. You're going to pick a tomato. You're going to harvest your tomato. Don't water it right before you're going to pick it because that will dilute the flavor of your tomato. You're going to remove any flower clusters. They're not going to produce anything. All it's doing is using energy that you don't want. And any small or excess fruits that you have on there, that's just going to use up energy, the plant that you want. You want that energy going into ripening those beautiful tomatoes, not trying to produce something that's going to get too cold for it to produce anyway. And then you're going to remove some of the leaves. That will also put more energy into the tomato. And all right. I'm going to go through this one. This is just a little bit of a review, how to prevent problems on your tomato fruits. So you're going to plant healthy, disease-free plants. You're going to stake those plants, just like Sherry talked about, for good air circulation. You're going to water them at the base, not overhead, because remember, that encourages diseases. But if you do need to water overhead, do water in the morning or midday so that the plant dries out before evening. Then monitor your plants and check for those pests. And avoid working with your plants when the leaves are wet or the fruit is wet because you can actually bring pathogens into your tomato plant. And remove and destroy any affected plants at the end of the season. And rotate your plants. That's very important. OSU has a lot of resources, our 10-minute university resources, and lots of resources. These will be emailed to you, so there's no reason to write these down. And I hope that everybody enjoys their tomatoes. And I will stop sharing and see if there are any questions. Hi,
Thank you so
Priscilla.
much, Jane and Sherry. It's been a very comprehensive webinar, not a lot of questions coming in. I think probably for those growing in containers, let's just review one more time how often we water those and how that is different from plants that are being grown in ground.
Sherry, do you want to take that one?
Sure, I can start and see if you have something to join in. Containers depends partly on the size of the container. The larger containers and deeper ones, the soil will stay moist longer than the smaller or shallower ones. So go for the largest size container that you can afford or have available. The second thing is you want to check the soil moisture by using a moisture reader or just use your fingers. But because container media is lighter, more porous, it's going to drain much faster and dry out faster. That's just a fact. So you should probably water your containers every other day to start out when the plant is small and the root is not extensive. And then you should get in the habit of checking the soil moisture very often, daily if possible. On very hot days, you may even need to water more than once a day in order to keep the soil from drying out. So when you grow tomatoes in containers, you have a higher risk for blossom end rot. And checking the moisture of the soil and keep up the watering is going to minimize the blossom end rot problem.
Yeah, well,
That,
was,
that's all. Yes, that's
yeah,
perfect, Sherry.
yeah. Very extensive information on this last bit on cultural practices. Great job, ladies. I don't really have any more questions that came from the group. Oh, wait, one question just came up. Let me see.
Is it
What?
okay to water over mulch? Is that what?
Oh,
Oh, what's the best way to check soil moisture? I actually use my finger because I only need to check the soil moisture where the roots are. So the finger will go down a few inches. The top layer can be in the ground, can be dry. That's healthy because it allows room for air to oxygenate the roots, but you don't want it to be dry deeper than the top couple inches. So, just poke your finger down or use a soil moisture reader. You can buy those things in stores inexpensively. That should do the trick.
Yeah, and the temperature of that soil changes as you get down into the moisture. So that's what you're looking for, is that cool,
Yeah.
moistness. Yeah.
The general rule of 1 inch of water per week is really a matter of evapotranspiration. So anyway, it has to do with the air temperature and soil temperature, which affect how much water the plant is losing. Higher temperature causes the plant to lose more water, and how much moisture the soil is losing. So warmer temperature is going to cause the soil to lose more water. And in aggregate, if we get 1 inch of rain a week, obviously the plant should get enough, as you don't have to water at all because the Mother Nature is doing that 1 inch. But if you are having to water, there is no rain, then you have to do the 1 inch per week. But you just always check before, make sure that that the soil is not moist in the top couple inches, because if you overwater, you're actually depriving the roots of oxygen. And I have seen people whose tomato plants are very sickly looking because they're watering every day and keeping the soil moist all the time, and that's not healthy either.
Well, that's great. I think that's a wrap.